Okay, so yesterday, this is where we left off. The Union had a plan. They had their strategy for winning the Civil War. Remember, it was called the Anaconda Plan. The idea was constrict the South from being able to move on the Mississippi, block their ports, and capture their capital of Richmond, Virginia. And so what they had done by the middle of 1862 is they had accomplished at least blocking the Mississippi River for most of the Mississippi River with capturing New Orleans. This helped prevent the Confederacy, the South, from being able to use the Mississippi River to transport troops, to transport goods, and other things like that, which was really detrimental to the South because they didn't have as many railroads or rivers and canals and things like that to use like the North did to move goods and people. And so this really slowed down the attack of the South moving into the later part of the war. So there were definitely, definitely some ups and downs there for the Union at the beginning, but really being able to take control in the West with Grant as their leader really helped. But in the East, it was a different story. In the East, so the Atlantic coast, the Confederates, the South, they were winning battle after battle after battle. They were under the leadership of Robert E. Lee. This is Robert E. Lee right here. And in 1862 and 1863, they had, I think it's like 6 or 7 different battle wins. These were significant in, one, defending their land, just like was in their strategy, the strategy of the South, defense, because the North was going to invade. And 2, keeping the Union away from their capital of Richmond. Most of these battles happen in Virginia, if not all of them. I think all of them happen in Virginia. And so with all of them happening in Virginia, they wanted to make sure they were keeping the Union from getting into Richmond and taking over their capital. So in 1862, the Confederate victories in Virginia, led by Robert E. Lee, 7 days battle, they defeated George McClellan. We'll talk more about these people in just a minute as well. The Second Battle of Bull Run, the Confederacy also defeated the Union. The Battle of Fredericksburg, and then the Battle of Chancellorsville, which we'll get to more in depth in just a minute. These are all in Virginia. I have family that actually lives in Fredericksburg, which is really cool. So my cousins live there, and my aunt and uncle, before they passed away, they lived in Fredericksburg and also Spotsylvania, which we'll get to that today as well. But so when you're driving around in these areas in Virginia, it's like they have a bunch of signs up that say Civil War battlefield, this or that. So there are people who live really close or where battles took place, which is pretty awesome. So these battles were significant in the South and the Confederacy in the East, defending their territory and defending their capital. The Battle of Antietam is our next battle we're going to talk about, September 17th, 1862. This battle is known as the single deadliest day of fighting in the entire Civil War. This is one day, this is a few hours of fighting, and you have close to 6,000 dead and 17,000 wounded, which is a lot. The Battle of Shiloh that we talked about yesterday, that was over a couple of days. This here is one day, 6,000 people died in one day, 17,000 wounded. So Robert E. Lee, the leader of the Confederate troops in the East, he is tired of the Union invading the South. And so he and the president of the Confederacy, whose name was Jefferson Davis, they come up with a plan to invade the North and attack Maryland. Remember, Maryland was one of those border states that decided not to secede and stayed with the Union. So what Lee plans to do is split his army into 4 parts once he's in Maryland to confuse the Union. So he writes these plans down, he sends them to his generals that he has with him, so they all know the plan, they know where they're going, they know the different areas that they're going, and one of the messengers loses the plan. And they are intercepted by George McClellan, who is the leader of the Union troops. Remember, Lincoln fires the first guy, hires George McClellan. Lincoln thinks he has the right guy, that McClellan is not going to be timid. He's not going to, he's going to act fast, he's going to think fast, and be able to move on with the strategy. Well, that ends up not being right. So McClellan intercepts Lee's plans. He knows exactly what Robert E. Lee is going to do. And instead of acting on this and attacking Lee before he can start with his plan, McClellan waits to see what Lee will do. He just waits. He sits and waits. And so what Lee does is he knows that the letter doesn't get to where it's supposed to go. So he's kind of rethinking his plan. Now he's kind of on the defensive when he was going to be the one attacking. Lee gathers his troop and attacks anyway, all because really McClellan doesn't act fast. McClellan has this inside information, but really does nothing with it, which is very frustrating to Lincoln, but for Robert E. Lee and the Confederacy, probably best for them. But what ends up happening is Lee goes into Maryland, Antietam, and he attacks he invades the North. And this battle, though McClellan knew what the orders were, and Lee knows now that McClellan knows or has an idea that he might know, the Union still wins this battle. Despite all the casualties from both sides, the Union still wins, which it's a key win for the Union because they are able to hold their territory and evade Confederate infiltration into the North. So they are able to keep the Confederacy from invading the North and moving towards their capital. And so that's a key win, but it's kind of bittersweet because of the number of casualties at Antietam. Again, Antietam is the single deadliest day of fighting in the entire war. There were so many deaths. If you look at this picture right here, there were so many deaths in this particular battle that for Antietam, they were digging mass graves for the people. And so it was pretty terrible. Again, medical, I think, Michael, you did your history fair project on, Civil War medicine, essentially. This was one of those times where the medicine and hospital needs were not readily available to people. Okay, so our next one, I'm sorry, yeah. I feel like I'm missing a slide. Yeah, that slide is not where it's supposed to be. Sorry, give me 1 second, y'all. I guess we'll go from here. It's fine there. Okay, so in 1862, Lincoln kind of sees how the role that slavery is taking in the war, and he realizes that now he does have to do something about slavery. Remember, before, when he got elected in 1860, his view was trying to keep slavery from spreading. Don't get rid of it. I'm not going to take it from where it is, but I'm not going to let it go any further. Quickly into the war, his view changed because he did see how it divided the nation. so much, and the impact of it, not only domestically but internationally as well. Slavery wasn't widely accepted anymore internationally, and so things had to change. And he also knew he had to get rid of it, but he also knew that it was going to be very difficult to do, knowing that the border states might get upset. What if the border states, if he decides to get rid of slavery, what if the border states decide to secede as well? And so again, he was wrestling with that idea. So what Lincoln does, with the aid of people like Frederick Douglass, Horace Greeley, these are prominent African Americans during this time period, or part of the abolitionist movement. They urge Lincoln, they say, you have to take a stance on slavery. You can't just ignore it. It's here, it's in the forefront, we're fighting a war over it, so you have to make a decision. So what Lincoln does is he issues the Emancipation Proclamation. What the Emancipation Proclamation does, why Lincoln issues this, is the Constitution does not give him the power as president to just get rid of slavery, to abolish it. You know, we have our checks and balances with our three branches, so there are steps you have to take in order to make a law like that for the country. But what Lincoln does know that the Constitution says, it does give the president the right to take property away from enemies during wartime. Technically, they're in war. Technically, the South is their enemy, and the South technically views slaves as their property. So Lincoln kind of finds this loophole in the verbiage that the South is using, you know, as slaves as their property, to say, you know, I can take your property away from you. And in his mind, he's saying, if I can take their property away, their property being slaves, if I can take their slaves away and bring them to the North, and they'll be free in the North. So that's Lincoln's thought process there. So he issues this in September of 1862, but it will not take place until January 1st, 1863. And what it states is that on January 1st, 1863, all enslaved persons in rebel territory would be free. Now, people look at this and they go, Lincoln freed the slaves. Wrong. That is not what it did. What it did not do is to free slaves in the border states, because the border states were not in the enemy territory or not in rebel territory. They stayed with the Union. So technically, the Emancipation Proclamation did nothing with slavery in those border states. All four of those border states had slavery. It did not free slaves in the Southern Territory until the war was over. If the Union could win the war, then it would free slaves. Okay, and then but what it did do is it showed that the U.S. government now had a stance on slavery. This was the very first time that the federal government was coming out and saying, slavery is wrong, we would like to abolish slavery. So it was really, it was a big, a big step, the Emancipation Proclamation was. Again, it did not end slavery. It did show that the federal government had a stance on slavery, saying that it was wrong, and if the Union won, there would be no more slavery in the United States. So all the Union had to do was win the war, right? Easy peasy. In May, moving into 1863, in May of 1863, you have the Battle of Chancellorsville in Virginia. This is a pretty significant battle because something happens at this battle that is very tough on the Confederates. So the Confederates, again, they're led by Lee, Robert E. Lee, also led by, under the leadership of Thomas Jackson, Stonewall Jackson. The Union is led by General Joseph Hooker, and the Union under Hooker, they have twice as many men. They have twice as many men as Lee does, and so Lincoln, he fired George McClellan. He's after Antietam, he's like, you did not act how I wanted you to act, so he fires McClellan, hires Joseph Hooker, and so Lincoln's like, okay, yes, this is going to be great. And Hooker's like, yeah, I got you, man. We are going to go. We're going to win. We're going to defeat Lee. We're going to finish the Anaconda Plan. We're going to win the war. So with twice as many men, the Union should win, right? Robert E. Lee finds out he's outnumbered. He sees he's outnumbered and he's like, okay, this is what I need to do. So he uses his brilliant command tactics. Robert E. Lee, I believe he finished, if not first, he finished like second in his class at West Point, the military academy. And so he was known for his genius. He was very much so a military genius, and the Battle of Chancellorsville is where, is one of the places where he shows that. So what Lee does is he divides his forces. You have some fighting on the front lines, and then you have others that secretly move to the end of the Union line. So imagine a straight line, and some of that line is fighting face to face with the Union. The other side kind of moves around to the side of where the Union's lines are. That flank, you call that a flank, is led by Stonewall Jackson. So he leads that flank. They are now attacking the Union from both sides. And what the Union has to do is they have to surrender and retreat, essentially, because they were not prepared for that surprise attack by Lee and Jackson. Now, tragedy strikes at Chancellorsville, because during this battle, and while Stonewall Jackson was leading that flank, there was some confusion among the men. I mean, you're in the middle of a battle and you have to act fast. And so not everybody's going to get word of what's happening. And if you're with Jackson, you have to follow Jackson. So amid the confusion, a Confederate soldier accidentally fires his gun, and that hit Stonewall Jackson in the arm. After the battle, Jackson's left arm has to be amputated. And after the amputation, Jackson develops pneumonia, and he dies a week later after the Battle of Chancellorsville. So because his immune system was weakened after the amputation, he was more susceptible to other viruses and things like that. And so he caught pneumonia and he dies. So the death of Stonewall Jackson really hit the morale of the Confederate soldiers and citizens. Besides Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson was like their number 2 guy. Jackson and Lee together were the dream team, and now half of your dream team is gone. Once Jackson dies, the morale of the South is hit really, really hard. It's really, really low. And honestly, it doesn't really recover much after that. And so you kind of see this slow decline of the Confederate troops. And I believe Stonewall Jackson is buried somewhere in Tennessee, if I remember correctly. Okay, so moving into some going back a little bit with some issues with Union leadership. So I've talked about 3 generals. Lincoln actually fires 4 of them during the early parts of the war. So Lincoln is really disappointed in the people he puts in charge. So at the very beginning of the war, you had General McDowell at the First Battle of Bull Run. He doesn't win, he's fired. George McClellan is hired. He's slow to act in battle, and sometimes, and what he did is he refused Lincoln's orders to follow the Confederates as they retreated at Antietam. Remember, the Union wins Antietam, even though a bunch of people die, and even though McClellan intercepted those orders, Lincoln said, you have to follow Lee no matter what, and McClellan doesn't do that. So you don't follow the president's orders, you're not going to get to keep your job, probably. The Battle of Fredericksburg, you have General Ambrose Burnside, that's him down here. He also was not aggressive enough for Lincoln at the Battle of Fredericksburg. Before Lincoln can fire him, Burnside says, you know what, I'll just resign. He's still in the army, just not, the general leading the troops. And then Thomas Hooker, that we just talked about, he and Lincoln were on the same page, but even with twice as many men as Lee at the Battle of Chancellorsville, he can't win. So Joseph Hooker is fired, he resigns as well. So Lincoln now has to hire somebody else. And this is in late June. He hires Major General George Meade. He worked with McClellan early in the war. Remember McClellan here. We're going to talk more about McClellan later, so keep him in mind. So McClellan knew, what Lincoln wanted. He knew the area. He was from Pennsylvania himself. He was actually hired 3 days before the Battle of Gettysburg. So we're going to talk about Gettysburg in just a second. It was actually like an accidental meeting. So we talked a little bit about this. Remember, the Confederacy did not allow African Americans to fight in the war. The Union, they did allow African Americans to fight in the war, but starting in 1862. Their ability to fight was doubted by white soldiers. 10% of the Union Army was African American. Lincoln, at the beginning of the war, was very worried, and other white leaders were also worried about how African American soldiers would be treated by white soldiers, which was true. I mean, even though people in the North maybe didn't necessarily want slavery, they still didn't necessarily want African Americans to have the same rights as them. And so there was this, still this us versus them, even in the North. But you did have African American soldiers fight. They had their own regiments. The most famous African American regiment was the 54th Massachusetts. They were created in 1862, I believe, and they were known for their courage and their bravery, especially at the Battle of Fort Wagner in South Carolina. This particular regiment, and these are pictures here of the 54th Massachusetts, they were led by Colonel Robert Gould Shaw. This is him here. And they were known for, really, a lot of soldiers wanted to fight with them because they knew when they got there, their fighting spirit, their morale, their determination was really an attitude lifter, a morale shifter in a positive way, and people wanted to fight with them. There is a movie on them called Glory. It was made in the 80s. It's a really, really good movie. Talk to your parents before you watch it. If we were in school still, we would probably be watching that, but I would obviously send a letter home, but talk to your parents about watching that. It's a really, really great movie that shows the determination of this particular group, and it has some people there I'm sure you recognize, and Denzel Washington and Morgan Freeman. So really, really great movie, but it goes into the movie ends with the Battle of Fort Wagner. At that battle, the 54th suffers over 300 casualties, which is a lot. A regiment, I think, is 1,000 men. It's a lot of people in that group that you're with all the time. And while they end up not winning that battle, they are known for their courage and bravery in a time where really the Union had them pinned down, but they continued to fight. So I encourage you to go watch that movie. It would be, it's really awesome. So here's the Battle of Gettysburg. If we were in class, we would be spending a little more time on this, but it was an accidental meeting of the Union and Confederate forces in Pennsylvania, which was Union territory. Both sides were really just kind of looking for supplies. You always send scouts out to look and see, and the scouts kind of spotted each other, and everybody goes back and kind of prepares for battle. Gettysburg, super, super small town. Most of us probably would not know Gettysburg if it wasn't for this Civil War battle. It's a 3-day battle. The first day of the battle is on July 1st of 1863. The Union, in the first day, they are outnumbered. So during this day, fighting starts when the sun comes up. That's when fighting starts. The Union is outnumbered, and they do have to fall back to an area called Cemetery Ridge. and they kind of regroup. The Union calls for reinforcements, as well as the Confederacy. Day 2, overnight, what the Union decides to do is they realize that they have to get higher ground. Remember, this is Union territory. They know it a little bit better. You do have soldiers pretty much from every state, including Florida, that fight in this battle. But overnight, the Union moves to higher ground, and they moved to a place called Little Round Top. So if you went to Washington, D.C. with us, we did go up to Little Round Top, and this is it here. This is, you're standing on kind of like rock formations looking out over the battlefield. Really easy to see if Confederate soldiers are coming towards you. Behind you, you have some woods. So you have some people looking out towards the woods, some people looking out on the field. And the Union is able to hold their position against Confederate forces. So day 1, the Confederacy wins. Day 2, the Union kind of wins. And so it all comes down to the next day, and both sides kind of know that. This picture, it's not that large, but it's a picture that I took when we've been on the DC trip. The battlefield today looks like it did in 1863, pretty much right after the battle happens. The people in Gettysburg know that it's an historic event. They know they need to preserve it. They know how important this battle was probably going to be in the grand scheme of the war, which it is, and we'll talk about that in just a second. So day 3, July 3rd, 1863, Lee wants to cause panic amongst his men. He the Union. So what he does is sun up, very beginning in the morning, he fires all of his cannons. He just starts firing his cannons. At the same time he's doing that, on one part of the battlefield, another part of the battlefield, you have George Pickett, who is a Confederate leader. He leads what's called Pickett's Charge with his men. They are running across a mile-long field towards the Union lines. The Union is kind of set up behind some fences, and the Union troops are told, don't move, just keep firing at the men. You know, the Confederate soldiers are running across the field. The Union is holding their position, and they just keep firing. George Pickett loses over half of his men in that charge, and they realize that they are not going to win. So the Confederates have to retreat. The Union wins the Battle of Gettysburg. And it is really important that they do. And really from this point forward, the Union is going to be on its way towards winning the war. It really was a tide turner for them in the East, for them to win this, because they had been not so great up until this point. Oh, let me talk about one thing. So this picture down here, if you ever go to Gettysburg, I know some of you went to DC, but this picture down here, this is a 360-degree painting of the 3-day Battle of Gettysburg. It was a French painter. He did it in the 1890s, I believe, 1880s, 1890s. And it is amazing. So they do a pretty cool light show, and someone kind of narrates what happens on the last, the third day, and it's just a really awesome thing to see. So it's moved to different places, but it is at Gettysburg. They call it the cyclorama. And I'm sure you can look up some things online. The painter, the artist, he actually painted himself into the painting. So if you ever go, I encourage you to look up and see where he is. So here are the results of the Battle of Gettysburg. The Union win pretty much ended any hope that the Confederates had of getting help from Britain and France. Remember, that was part of their strategy at the beginning of the war, is get help from Britain and France, because they didn't have as many resources as the Union did, but they hoped that they would be able to get those from Britain and France. The slavery was obviously over war, which is kind of also another reason why Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, make it over slavery. Britain and France don't help. Now the Confederates are kind of on the downslope. They lost a big battle. And so it was Britain and France are like, no, we're not going to get in the middle of this. The Union only casualties, and they won. It was 23,000. These pictures here, these are pictures from the Battle of Gettysburg. The Confederate casualties, 25,000. So in 3 days, you have almost 50,000, if not more, casualties. Deaths, wounded, missing, captured, kind of thing. The next day, on July 4th, 1863, that last city on the Mississippi River that the Union needed to capture, they did in Vicksburg. And now the Union completely controls the Mississippi River. The Battle of Gettysburg, them being able to defend their territory, and now Vicksburg, the Union really is on the upswing, ready to win the war. A few months later, about 4 months after the Battle of Gettysburg ends, they dedicate a national cemetery in Gettysburg to those that died at the battle. So you have Lincoln is the main speaker. He is the keynote speaker. There are a few different people who speak before him. There's a governor from a state that comes to talk, and that governor talks for 2 hours. Lincoln gets up and he speaks for 2 minutes. The Gettysburg Address was 272 words. And in the speech, he really expresses what the war had come to mean to the people of the United States and to him as the leader. And he says, this is a pretty famous part from the speech, he says, "It is for us, the living, to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us." And that task was to win the war. "That these dead shall not have died in vain," died for no reason. "That this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom. And that government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish from the earth." So Lincoln said, this is about, bringing the Union back together, making sure that the people who have died in this war, really on either side, that it's not for nothing, that their deaths mean something, that them fighting for something, that them fighting actually meant something. All right, so we're going to look at the final stages of war, things leading to the Confederacy surrendering to the Union. So we're moving into 1864 here. The Confederate forces really are surrounded by the Union. The ports and coasts are blocked. The Mississippi River is controlled by the Union. And so now the only part left for the Union to accomplish of the Anaconda Plan is to capture Richmond, which is the Confederate capital. So having the West under control, what Abraham Lincoln decides to do is bring Ulysses S. Grant to the East. He said, okay, your leadership in the West is really, really awesome. I've needed your leadership in the East, and maybe this war would have been over before. So Grant is moved to the East to take control of the Union forces, and he comes up with his own plan. He says, I'm going to attack Richmond, and William Sherman is going to attack the Deep South. And when he does that, he's just going to march all the way up and meet me in Richmond, and we're going to take control. So that's his plan. This is what happens between February and April 1865 to kind of bring that plan to fruition. So Grant moves closer to Richmond, and between May and June of 1864, these become the 6 bloodiest weeks of fighting, where Grant actually earns the nickname the Butcher. So Grant finds Lee in 3 different battles outside of Richmond. Lee knows that the Union's moving in, and he knows like his main job now is to protect the capital. And so you have 3 battles. You have the Battle of Wilderness. Lee has 60,000 men. Grant has 100,000 men. And this is where Grant having plan A only really comes in. You really see this. And the men knew, like, we're fighting for Grant, like, we're going, like, we're not stopping, we're going, we're doing what he says. So the Battle of Wilderness, you actually have about 200 men die from wildfires that spread throughout the camps in the area. But the Union still does win this one. The two other battles, you have the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse and the Battle of Cold Harbor. Moving into those battles, the men, what they start to do is pin their names into their jackets, because they know, like, if they die, they want their family to be able to identify them. This is before the time of dog tags and things like that. So identifying bodies on the battlefield was sometimes not always the easiest thing to do. During this 6 weeks, 30 days within the 6 weeks, Grant loses over 50,000 men. He's not playing around. There's no joking. They are going to work and you're here. And a lot of the men were like, yep, I'm ready to go fight. And if I die for my country, for this cause, I do that. That was just the leadership that Grant brought to the table. The Confederates, they surrender in all three battles, even with the wildfires kind of keeping them from battling the way they should. The Confederates do surrender, and it is really, it's a way for the Union to move closer into Richmond. Again, this is where Grant earns the nickname the Butcher. The other part of Grant's plan, remember, is sending William Sherman into the Deep South. So William T. Sherman, or William Tecumseh Sherman, this is him right here. He was younger. He was also a no-nonsense kind of guy. I feel like you can always tell that from his face in this picture. But he was kind of like a child military prodigy. He went to West Point at 16, or maybe graduated from West Point at 16, or went there at 16. He came from a family that just kind of helped. His family was poor, but another family that kind of adopted him, took him in, and helped him become this military powerhouse. So Sherman fought in many of the early battles, like First Bull Run, Shiloh, Vicksburg. He had an idea. He believed in total warfare, which basically he wanted to break the backbone of rebellion by using this total warfare, this total war idea. The idea was scorched earth, and basically you destroy everything in your path. And destroy anything and everything that your enemies could use to come back and fight against you. So when Sherman went to the Deep South, I'm talking like Georgia, the Carolinas, places like that, he burned a lot of the farmland. And what ends up happening after the war is a lot of the southern farmland was useless for large crops, for cash crops and things like that. And so this led to a lot of issues during Reconstruction, which we'll talk about in a couple weeks. He does go to Atlanta, and if you've ever watched Gone with the Wind, there's a part where they have the Union troops coming into Atlanta, but he does defeat Confederate General John Hood in September of 1864. A lot of people flee the city when the Union troops attack and kind of take over and start occupying that city. So they are making these small steps towards winning the war, and Sherman had his role in that. Real quickly, a couple of battles in Florida near us that I like to talk about. You have in February 20th of 1864, you have the Battle of Olustee. If you have been on I-10 driving towards Jacksonville, you've probably seen signs for the Battle of Olustee. And this battle, the Union troops, they land in Jacksonville, and they basically want to move inland and try just to cut off more supply lines. Remember, the Union does have the ports in Florida, and they basically want to cut Florida off from the rest of the Confederacy. So the Union troops, though, once they move inland, the Confederate troops are ready for them and they have to flee back towards Jacksonville. So the Confederates actually win the Battle of Olustee. And then you also have the Battle of Natural Bridge. This happens on March 6, 1865, about a month before the war actually ends. Trying to do the same thing, the Union is wanting to kind of take over these Confederate capitals. So what the Union does is they go and they kind of they land in the St. Mark's area. So if you've been down there, so land in the St. Mark's area, and their goal is to march towards Tallahassee. What the citizens do, though, when they hear that the Union troops are doing that, is they fortify the city, and basically they call it Fort Houston. I'm not really sure where that comes from, but they fortify the city. But the citizens are able to defend the capital, and the Union troops have to retreat. They don't make it very far they don't make it really that close to Tallahassee, but this is one of the last victories for the Confederacy before the war is over. Every year they have a reenactment down in St. Mark's of this battle. I believe it's the first weekend in March because it's close to when the battle actually happened. So there's like a festival down there. I've never been, but I've always wanted to go. But I encourage you in the future if you wanted to go, because that's a really cool, close Civil War battle to us. Okay, so the election of 1864, this is the only election where you don't have the southern states voting. Remember, they've all seceded, and they're part of the Confederate States of America, so they are not invited in our vote in 1864. Lincoln is reelected by a landslide. Lincoln runs against George McClellan. Remember him, one of his former generals. George McClellan gets a total of 21 electoral votes to Lincoln's 212. So McClellan really didn't have very much of a chance, with Lincoln, against Lincoln. All right, so moving into the war ending, remember Grant and his men are moving closer and closer to Richmond. What the Union does is they capture a main railroad town going into Richmond called Petersburg. And they take over this train station. This cuts off supplies to Richmond, which is no bueno when it comes to needing to get supplies to your capital. And what the Union does, taking control of this railroad, they move in their own soldiers and their own supplies, and this surprises the Confederate soldiers on the other end. So for 9 months, Grant and Lee fight in and very close to Richmond, and eventually Lee has to retreat out of Richmond. So the Confederate president, Jefferson Davis, he also retreats. And the rest of the leadership of the Confederate States, they know that the war is going to be wrapping up very soon. At the same time, Sherman has attacked Atlanta, and now he's marching north through the Carolinas to meet Grant in Richmond. This is known as Sherman's March to the Sea. And you also, as Sherman's going up through, Georgia and the Carolinas and into Virginia, and you have a lot of African Americans that just go with him, and they use that and view that as kind of their march to freedom. They're leaving, the binds of slavery and marching north to freedom. So in March of 1865, after being elected in 1864, Lincoln gives his inaugural speech, and then on April 4th, 1865, Lincoln walks the streets of Richmond. This is just 5 days before Lincoln would be assassinated by John Wilkes Booth. So it is, everything kind of happens very quickly at this point. So on April 9th, 1865, this is when the formal end of the war comes. After Lee has to retreat from Richmond, Grant follows him. Grant knows where he is, and Grant writes him a letter, and he convinces Lee to give up. In his letter, he says, The results of last week, meaning the fall of Richmond, must convince you of the hopelessness of further resistance. He's like, basically he's saying, yo, like, you lost. You need to give up. There's no way you're going to beat us. So on April 9th, 1865, the two meet at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. What's really funny is this is this is essentially the same spot as where the first Battle of Bull Run happened. So the war really starts and ends in the same place, which is kind of crazy. So they meet, they negotiate the terms of Lee's surrender. And this is a famous painting here of Lee surrendering to Grant. But Grant's terms were that the Confederate soldiers could keep small firearms like a pistol, but they'd have to turn in their like rifles and things like that. And they could also keep their horses and they could go home. And they would also give them rations of food that they could divide amongst the men how they needed to. But that basically they would be sent home. They would not be bothered. They can keep, a small firearm for protection purposes. So this happens on April 9th of 1865. That's the formal end of the war. And here's kind of what we know, the positives and negatives that come out of the Civil War itself. So some positives, the Union was saved. The Confederate states lost, and those states would come back into the Union. The federal government kind of flexed its muscles and showed that it was more powerful than the states. The states do have power over some things, but some things they don't. Some things the federal government is just in charge of, and this kind of showed that in this time. And then another positive is the 13th Amendment was passed. African Americans were freed from slavery. They were no longer slaves. But some negatives on the side of that is more lives were lost in the Civil War than any war in American history. Obviously, it was just Americans fighting it. So Americans were dying. Typo there. It caused billions of dollars of damages and ruined farms in the South. So the South really had to be rebuilt. The time after the Civil War is known as Reconstruction, literally because we had to reconstruct physically, politically, economically, all of that. And so it was, there was so much damage in the South. So now we have all these states that seceded, but what's the plan to bring them back into the Union? What does that look like? Is there some kind of penalty? Is there something they're going to have to do in order to come back? Like, how does that work? And then also the issue, we have all these freed African Americans now, no more slavery, but what exactly are their rights? And so that time of Reconstruction, really socially, economically, politically, physically rebuilding the nation, a big part of that was what did the rights look like for African Americans? Okay, so that is the second part of the Civil War. I am going to, in just a few minutes, start the question and answer session or my office hours from 11 to 12. So if you need to pop in and ask me some questions or just get clarification on things, then that is fine with me. Michael, I'm sorry, I just saw your chat. When the ambulance system, was that after Antietam? Is that what you were trying to tell me? Okay, well, but yeah, the ambulance system was created during the Civil War just to kind of move people on and off battlefields and things like that. So again, I'm going to start the question and answer. Hello from Tyler today. Hello. And you guys can pop in there if you have any questions. All of your discussion questions in both packets, those are all posted on my website. So you're free to complete those at your leisure. And once you're done, you're done. Those are all due on the 27th, by the 27th, just so I can get grades in for you. But I love you guys and I miss you, and I'll see you in a couple weeks. when we talk about Reconstruction. Bye.